So this is our first spring public lecture of the Judeo-Christian Studies series. I've been told that we are one of the longest standing series in the country. 1980, which happens to be the year I came to Tulane, Father Val started it, and we're still going strong. So it's great. Please sign up on our sign-up sheets if we don't have you on our email list. Zena Hitz knows or has worked with several of our graduate students, some of our terrific PhD philosophy students. So one of them was excited to introduce her tonight, and that is Joseph Keegin. So I'm going to turn the podium over to Joey for an introduction, and then we'll go on to Zena, and I hope we'll have time for questions and answers period afterwards. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much, Rhonda. Can everybody hear me okay? The first thing I'll say is I really look forward to the day when our distinguished guest doesn't need any introduction, because her influence on the culture of education in America is so obvious and deeply felt that on every college campus in America, she has the status of a Homeric hero. But inasmuch as she's still working on it, it's my honor to introduce my good friend, Zena Hitz. Ms. Hitz is a tutor at St. John's College in Annapolis, the school from which she also earned her bachelor's degree. She holds an MPhil in classics from Cambridge University and a PhD in philosophy from Princeton, where she's returned this sabbatical year on a joint fellowship with the Project in Philosophy of Religion and the James Madison Program in American Ideals, exploring the question that has guided much of her writing over the past several years. That question is, what exactly is the value of learning for its own sake? In pursuit of this question, she has authored 2 books, the first of which deals directly with this. It's called Lost in Thought, The Hidden Pleasures of an Intellectual Life. That's published by Princeton University Press in 2020. And more recently, she published the book, A Philosopher Looks at the Religious Life, and that was published last year by Cambridge University. Her writing can be found in outlets such as The New Statesman, The Chronicle of Higher Education, First Things Magazine, Plow Magazine, Modern Age, Commonweal, The Washington Post, and many, many other places. And she's also the founder and president of the Catherine Project, a new educational initiative seeking to foster communities of learning based on conversation and hospitality. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But a little bit of biographical information, if I may. Ms. Hitz grew up in San Francisco in a household full of books and of discussion and argument about them. After teaching for some time at Auburn University and at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, Zena joined a Catholic religious community in southeastern Ontario called the Madonna House, where she spent 3 years dedicated to manual labor in the service of others. She left there in 2015 to return to St. John's, this time in the role of a teacher instead of a student. And since returning from the forests of Canada to the dog-eat-dog world of academia, Ms. Hitz has become one of America's most fierce and intelligent defenders of liberal education in its old meaning, the kind of education that is both befitting and productive of human freedom and happiness, a kind of education that is good for its own sake and not for some further instrumental goal. And in the spirit of the democratic educational reformers of the early 20th century that built both a place like St. John's and also places like the various working men's institutes in both America and the UK, Ms. Hitz has argued in countless public outlets that because an intellectual life is good for every human being, the means of cultivating it should therefore be available to anyone with the interest and ability to do so. This is the conviction that runs through her excellent first book, Lost in Thought. It is also the goal of her Catherine Project, to connect learners and thinkers around the country and world to experience what she has described as, quote, the pinnacle of the intellectual life, to sit around a table, in this case virtual, talking about the deep questions inspired by an excellent book. And you can find more information about the Catherine Project and sign up for one of their many study groups at the website catherineproject.org, and I recommend everybody check it out. It's a great organization. But today, Ms. Hitz will be speaking to us about God and the search for happiness. So please welcome my friend, Ms. Zena Hitz.
Thank you, Joey, for that wonderful introduction. Very flattering. And thanks to Rona and all of her crew for the wonderful time. I've spent a delightful couple of days here at Tulane. And thanks to all of you for coming out on this dark and rainy night. So this talk is it originates in the book about the religious life, which is my second book, not the one about education, but there is some overlap. What I want to talk about tonight is the question of whether life is futile because things come to an end. So I'm going to be circling around this question rather than really nailing it down tight. It's too difficult to do that. But let's call it, I'll refer to it sometimes as the question of transience, whether the fact that things come to an end makes life futile, empty, and happiness impossible. So this talk originates from, as I say, my recent book on the religious life in Christianity, and I'm going to begin from there, but it should be pretty obvious already that its question is not specific either to the Christian religion or to the religious life or to any religion. It's a human question. But we begin from the context of the religious life. And in this context, what I mean by the religious life is the way of life lived by radical Christians, where men and women abandon ordinary ways of life, marriage, family, wealth, commerce, and power, for lives of solitude, prayer, and service. Such are the lives of contemporary nuns, monks, friars, and hermits. The stories or accounts of these lives are often feature what's a call, perception of a vocation to this type of life. And at the roots of that call is sometimes, even regularly, not always, but regularly, a perception of futility of ordinary life. And I'll be bringing in the book of Ecclesiastes for those of you who like that kind of thing. Just trying to sweeten the pot to keep you listening. Okay. Everyone loves Ecclesiastes, I think. So for a guiding example to help keep in mind the sort of radical sacrifice at the core of the religious life, I'd like to turn to the founder, just briefly, to the founder of Christian monasticism, Antony the Abbot. Antony grew up in a prosperous Christian family in provincial Egypt in the 3rd century CE. His parents died when he was a young man, leaving him 300 fruitful acres. Not long after their death, he walked to church, thinking of how in the book of Acts, the disciples sold all they had to live in common, giving to each according to his need. In church, he heard read the gospel of the rich young man. In this gospel, a young man asks what he must do to inherit eternal life beyond the following of the commandments. Jesus tells him to sell all he has, give it to the poor, quote, so that he will have treasure in heaven, and to follow him. The young man goes away sad because he has many possessions. So Antony heard this and took it as a direct personal instruction. He sold his family lands, gave away his possessions, and went to live in solitude in the desert. There he lived a life of an asceticism that we might call extreme, in terms of eating bugs, wearing rags, sleeping on the soil, etc. Despite this high degree of asceticism, or because of it, flocks of disciples chased him into ever more desolate places. So he was always looking for a place that was slightly more lonely, and then these crowds of people would turn up. The story of his life was written by Athanasius and caused a sensation in late antiquity that lasted at least until the time of Augustine, inspiring religious foundations in the East and in the West. I said Augustine, and she started crying. That's so interesting. Augustine, for those of you who know his confessions well, the reading of the life of Antony has a pivotal effect in the period just before his transformation, his transformative conversion. So according to the gospel story that inspires Antony, eternal life is the goal of a Christian life. Otherwise, however mysterious his life might seem, he is not obviously responding to the transience of existence or a sense of the futility of everything. Nor, for that matter, is the equally famous story of Francis of Assisi, who abandoned the life, who's a 12th century Italian saint, who abandoned the life of a rich bon vivant after encountering a person with leprosy on the road. But by contrast, consider, and now I'm going into a proper story, a piece of fiction, which I always mix together with history, and someone can ask me about that if they want the sort of go-to deep question, why mix stories with history? So consider the story of a young nun that's presented in the 2013 Polish film, Ida. Ida had been a Jewish child left as an infant on the doorstep of a convent where she had been raised. As the film begins, she is preparing to make her profession as a nun and join the community. She leaves for a time to get to know her only living family member, which the abbess tells her about. And she learns about the violent end of her family. So she has a kind of confrontation with death and evil and violence. While outside the convent, she also meets an attractive young musician. After the death of her relative, she meets him again. They spend the night together. The next morning, he invites her to spend the day with his band. And she asks, well, and after that, what will we do? We'll buy a dog. And after that, we'll get married and have a few kids. She asks, and after that? He answers, the usual life. She recognizes this answer as the evasion of an unanswerable question. She puts her habit back on and walks back to the convent. Ida's line of questioning points to transience. After all these things, the band practice, the acquisition of a dog, the wedding, bearing children, we all know that death awaits. But I think she is concerned with more than just transience, just the fact that things pass away. The temporal question after that seems to stand in for a question of purpose. What is all this for? What's the point of going on? What does the love of these two people culminate in beyond itself? The question of transience and the question of purpose are not unrelated. We are accustomed to thinking of purpose as irrelevant to duration. So I go to the grocery store to buy tamarind paste, and they have no tamarind paste. This was a true story. Okay. My purpose has been thwarted, and my task is futile. So I've done something that's futile. But suppose my purpose is something imminent in my activity. I'm gazing at the sky because it's beautiful. There's no further outcome needed. I'm doing mathematics for the love of it. In activities that we might call, in tradition following Aristotle, leisurely activities, activities that are valuable in themselves, that life seems to culminate in, I seem to escape time and temporality. I'm not waiting for some future culmination of my action. I have all I want right in the moment. Accordingly, one kind of response to the problem of transience, the question of transience, however we understand it, is that we can take our satisfaction in moments that have imminent value, their goodness contained in them. But I'm not sure that this actually evades the difficulty, which I still haven't really gone into in detail, but I will. And I'm not sure that the problems are exactly the same. I'm not sure that the problem of transience is exactly the same about the ultimate ends of life, but the two kinds of questions intersect and overlap in ways that are quite bewildering. So again, I have a few more stories to help us circle around the difficulty. And of course, in the end, I'm not sure we'll have done much more than circle, but this is a talk about the futility of human existence, so circling seems perfect. Here's another story. This is a historical story. Mother Walada Petros, an Ethiopian noblewoman of the 17th century, had 4 children in a row who died shortly after childbirth. After that, writes her hagiographer, she bore in mind the transience of the world. Her husband still loved her, but she no longer wanted to stay with him. She spent her days in prayer and fasting, her nights in vigils. She threw banquets on holidays to which all were invited, the poor and the wretched, along with townspeople and priests. When her husband left on a military campaign, she saw her chance. She gave away all her possessions, including all of her jewelry, 80 ounces weight of gold, and with 2 monks and 3 servants, walked all through the night. They traveled several days to the monastic settlement at Zade, where Willada Petros shaved her head, took a nun's cap, and swore to remain for the rest of her life. Now, there's more astonishing pieces of the story of Willada Petros. There's a wonderful book also available from Princeton University Press. They've just translated her hagiography, and it's absolutely incredible. So she's a Christian of the ancient Orthodox Ethiopian faith. These Jesuit missionaries are coming from Portugal, trying to convert Ethiopia to Roman Catholicism, and there's a massive political struggle around that. And she plays an instrumental role in keeping the country to its original traditions, but there's also this huge battle between her and her husband about whether she should be a nun or not. And there's armed guards and kidnappings and escapes and time in prison and all kinds of things. But she does finally live peacefully and she founded 6 communities and ended up having about 800 followers, so an extremely influential religious figure. I go through that quickly because the main thing is that the vocation, her call to the religious life, was rooted in a perception of transience. She loses these 4 children, one after another. Once she perceives it, she's moved to sacrifice wealth, privilege, beauty, and married life to live this ascetical Christian life. The grief of Willada Petros and her call to religious life, I think, is illuminated a bit by a 20th century Orthodox nun who found her vocation after the death of her own infant daughter. So Mother Maria Skatsova describes her manner of mourning the death of her infant daughter. For some, it is not even a question of grief, but the sudden opening of gates into eternity. This is Mother Maria Skatsova, not me. While the whole of natural existence has lost its stability and its coherence, yesterday's laws have been abolished, desires have faded, meaningless has displaced meaning, and a different, albeit incomprehensible, meaning has caused wings to sprout at one's back. Into the grave's stark maw are plunged all hopes, plans, habits, calculations, and above all, the whole meaning of life. In the face of this, everything needs to be re-examined or rejected against falsehood or corruption. She makes clear in another passage that for her, grief reveals the truth about the world. That it's not just a visitation of God, but a revelation of the nature of things. So for Mother Maria Skatsova, the collapse of meaning in the heart of grief clarifies in some mysterious way the vision of the eternal. The vision of death, since it destroys every illusion, reveals the reality that is beyond things that die. So let's set aside for the time being, actually it's not just for the time being, I'll set it aside for a while, and that's until the question period, as to whether and how there is an eternal reality. Why does Mother Maria think that life without grief is blindness? The reality indicated here is that the child was always a mortal thing. Everything that we love and care about is mortal and passes away. We consider it a great grief, and it is, to witness a death out of proper time. Yet apart from its intense emotional valence, it isn't obvious why something inevitable, death, which happens to each one of us, happening somewhat earlier, should be seen as a special interruption of the way things are, rather than, as Mother Maria suggests, a revelation of the way things always are. So the perception of transience, the universal destiny of all things in death and decay, is also at the root of other vocation stories. And this is where the vocation is a reaction to success and happiness rather than pain and grief. So there's an interesting, I'll talk about this a bit more later, for those of you who are Bible people, I know there are some here because you're Rana students. Ecclesiastes and Job, right, tonight are these two books. One is written from the point of view of Solomon, the greatest king of all time, richest king of all time in Israel, and the other is Job. And there are no thinkers closer in the whole Hebrew Bible than the perception of this king who has everything and this man who, according to the story, has lost everything. So there's something really interesting there. And so sure enough, in these stories, we have these people who had suffered terrible loss and felt a call, and now we get someone who gave everything up from the point of view of great success, a bit more like Antony at the beginning. So in Teresa of Avila's account of the foundation of her monasteries, she tells the tale of another noblewoman with a religious vocation. Dona Casilda is beautiful and the heir to a large fortune. Her older siblings have gone to religion themselves. Her relatives fear the same for her, so they betroth her to a relative when she is only 10 or 11 years old. Contrary to what we might expect, she falls deeply in love with her fiancé. Teresa writes, "She had been spending a very happy day with her betrothed, whom she loved with an intensity rare for a child her age, when suddenly she became very sad, for she realized that the day was over and that all other days would come to an end in the same way." Dona Casilda attends a liturgy where a young woman is becoming a nun, is clothed in the Carmelite habit. She's enchanted by the poverty of the monastery. It's one of Teresa's monasteries. But she feels this intense call to be in this place and to give everything up. But like Walada Petros, she meets with several obstacles. In this case, I am going to tell you about them because I think they're easier to go through quickly and they're part of the greatness of the story. So at first, the priory refuses to accept her as a nun without her family's consent. But she returns by the first of a series of complex gambits. So she asks to stop by the monastery to make a donation, and then she slips inside and throws her arms around the statue of a Virgin Mary and begs the prioress to accept her as a nun. The prioress agrees, but the family still disagrees, so they have her removed by a royal order. And then finally, one day, she's attending Mass at a church with her mother and her governess. Her mother steps into the confessional. Dona Casilda acts quickly, sends her governess away to ask a priest a question, and in Teresa's account, she stuck her overshoes up her sleeves, caught up her skirt, and ran away with the greatest possible haste to this convent, which was a long way away. The governess tries and fails to overtake her, and she's accepted instantly when she arrives. One of the reasons why I give the details is that it's impossible to believe, this is I think one piece of the picture, it's impossible to believe that a bloodless intellectual conviction could drive these kind of determined sacrifices. And nor could ambition, at least not in any obvious way. These particular women sacrifice all of the benefits of wealth and nobility, not only comfort, but prestige and power, typical objects of human striving. And in both cases, they reject some kind of fulfillment, like Ida the nun, some kind of fulfillment of romantic hopes and dreams. So what drives these women? What's the character of their motivation? That's going to be the end of my stories. I'm going to be now just trying to think through the question a bit. So one possibility, of course, is that they're motivated by a kind of fear or despair, a desire to hide from or to escape from the pains of life. When they describe the transience of things and the eternal that it discloses, when they act in this intense, what looks like out of an intense love, they are speaking in bad faith from the perspective of an illusion. Still, it seems worthwhile to test the hypothesis that fits these phenomena more closely and fits their subjective perception of what's going on, which is that these women are in love. They're acting out of a passionate love. And then the natural question is, in love with what? Or in love with whom? Poverty seems to enchant both Dona Casilda and Walada Petros. Or like Antony or St. Francis, they're in love with the Christ of the Gospels, the poor man of poor men. We might think a bit about, I think I'm going to bring this in there's a philosophy parallel that I think is worth meditating on. So Socrates, father of philosophy, sometimes describes himself as giving everything up for the love of wisdom. He also lives in a kind of poverty. He also seems to have a kind of ascetical existence. But most obviously, in these cases of religious life, the women are in love with God as transcendent and eternal. So their love for God as the transcendent and eternal, under that aspect, is sparked by an insight that leads them to reject the ordinary objects of love. Wealth, power, and even distinctive human individuals, husband, fiancé, mother, father, brother, sister. In this latter respect, their love for the eternal and transcendent demands a total renunciation or a total dedication, depending on whether one looks at what's lost, that is renunciation, or what's gained, that's dedication. So in this talk, I avoid, with maybe not great consequences, the nature exactly of what is gained, the nature of the eternal object of desire, because I'm still trying to understand and wrestle with the critical response, the sense that there's something inadequate in regular life, and that's the thing which ends up displaying this other desire, which is in a way even more mysterious, amazing. Okay. So let's consider, given that, the aspect of total renunciation, the giving up of everything. That's the response to the perception of transience. This day will end like all the others, Doña Casilda says. She seems to say that since even the most wonderful experiences happen in a sequence, one after the other, each coming to an end. Because of that, they can't qualify as goods in which one's happiness might lie. All of the goods a person might dream or strive for, including the most intense, eminently valuable activities and experiences, turn to dust. So now I'm going to look for some help with the brilliant poet of transience, the author of the book of Ecclesiastes. So the book of Ecclesiastes is written in the voice of King Solomon. Vanity of vanities, all things are vanity. What profit do we have from all the toil which we toil at under the sun? One generation departs, this is Ecclesiastes, not me. Another generation comes, but the earth endures forever. There's no remembrance of past generations, nor will future generations be remembered by those who come after them. I have seen all things that are done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and chase after wind. So part of the prospect here is not just, and I've tried to avoid this throughout the talk, but it's not just the prospect of one's own death or the prospect of the death of another, it's the prospect of sort of the universal destiny of destruction. That is that everything that exists currently will come to an end, and everything after that, and everything after that, and everything after that. This seems to be the core vision of Ecclesiastes. So philosophers like us, some of us, might hold out a hope. Surely knowing and seeing the futility of everything, surely that's an advantageous position. But not for Ecclesiastes. He says, though I said to myself, I have greatly increased my wisdom. Beyond all who were before me, my mind has broad experience of wisdom and knowledge. Yet when I applied my mind to know wisdom and knowledge, madness and folly, I learned that this also is a chase after wind. For much wisdom there is much sorrow, and whoever increases knowledge increases grief. So he actually has two, maybe it's crass to call them arguments, but two complaints about wisdom and knowledge as the goal of life. One is that it just makes you sadder, and the other is that even the wise man dies with a fool, so even wisdom has its eternal destiny. And I remember in this context, this wonderful passage in the Iliad, where I can't remember who it is, but one of the warriors falls in the dust, and Homer describes him as having forgotten horsemanship. So every piece of knowledge and wisdom we acquire, however great in the time, it all dies with us, right? It too meets this eternal destiny of destruction. So for the speaker of Ecclesiastes, not only do grand palaces and gardens, fine wine, and beautiful women not amount to anything, even wisdom, the gift for which Solomon is most renowned, is pointless, since the wise man and the fool go to the same place, the grave. Likewise, being a good person or helping others, also futile, because the just and the bad man go to the same place. This is a complaint that Job also makes. So, as I mentioned earlier, Ecclesiastes speaks to the emptiness of all things from the perspective of the wisest, wealthiest, and most powerful king of Israel. And his words are echoed nowhere more closely than in the speeches of Job, the once wealthy man who loses his property along with his 12 children in a single day. So Job sits scratching his boils with a potsherd, scolded and belittled by his comforters, demanding that God justify his fate. Solomon in his cushy palace, surrounded by every luxury, does not demand or lament the way that Job does. But his success yields an insight similar to that yielded by Job's grief. Birth and death make all acquisition futile, and the ways of God are inscrutable, and many other examples. So, is it true? Seems like a good time to ask the question, 7:35. Is it true that the transience of things, the inevitability of death and of endings, the universal destiny of destruction, drains ordinary life of its value? Philosopher Thomas Nagel famously argues in a paper called The Absurd that it does not. And here he's echoing another famous paper by Bernard Williams. Nagel argues that if something matters, no extension of the time in which it exists makes it matter more, any more than its small size expanded would also increase the degree it matters. So the realm of value, so to speak, the realm of goodness, and the realm of extension, whether in space or time, are just totally different kinds of things. So for Nagel, it's our unlimited capacity to seek justification, like why this, why that, like Ida saying, after that, after that, after that. It's that capacity to seek justification, to ask questions, not the structure of our desires, that forces a sense of absurdity. So the sense of absurdity is not real. Life seems pointless and absurd only because we are always able to question any candidate for its meaning. Now, I think that Nagel has misframed the problem and come to a solution too easily. When we seek a meaningful life, we mean a satisfying life, a life that provides happiness that's worth its suffering. I can formulate a question in words that has no impact on my general sense of satisfaction. Life is pointless and absurd, in other words, not because we can always ask questions about it, or always imagine things to be different, but only when we care deeply about things that we cannot have. The absurdity that interests us is when our passion for the unattainable, or what seems unattainable, drives us to approach life with the wrong tools, like emptying the lake with a sieve. So you're trying to get something eternal, and you're compulsively going after it again and again and again. It's never going to become eternal by repetition. So whether or not we have this kind of absurdity, the absurdity of caring deeply about things we cannot have, can only be settled by looking at what we in fact care deeply about and asking whether we can have it, and if not, how that desire might be managed. Nagel's claim that the universal destiny of destruction does not strip life of meaning relies on thinking that something's duration does not affect whether it matters or not. If it matters now, it won't matter more for lasting longer. If it doesn't matter, no length of time will grant it the power to do so. Nagel has assumed value and added time. He's not considered that time, or how we imagine time, plays a significant or even a necessary role in giving things their value and their meaning and their importance for us. So here again, I take a page from Ecclesiastes. He uses these beautiful metaphors. I'll go straight to the eye is not satisfied by seeing, nor has the ear enough of hearing. Now he gets to that through these beautiful images. The sun rises and the sun sets, and then it presses on again to the place it rises. The wind constantly shifts its course, north then south and back to north. All rivers flow to the sea, but the sea's never full. So the idea seems to be that we're never satisfied. That seems to be the fundamental sense in which all is vanity. And as as Ecclesiastes also says at the end of the 3rd chapter, God has put the eternal into our hearts. So we have a desire for something eternal, and nothing that we have can satisfy it. That is all to say that to love something or someone entails wanting it to last. That is so for a beloved human being as much as it is for a treasured teapot. Some precious experiences are essentially shaped by their ending. This is a point that Nagel and Williams like to make. Music or a conversation. You wouldn't want them to go on forever. They've got to come to an end. But if a beloved piece of music or a beloved conversation partner were to be permanently extinguished from the face of the earth, our response would be grief, and rightly. So it's true that our experiences, in other words, are episodic. You have a conversation, you go to a class, you hear a piece of music. Those things are all characterized by having a beginning and an end, and you don't want to extend them all indefinitely. But it's also true that we carefully cultivate the objects of our experience, taking care of or supporting them if they're people, donating or volunteering to support them if they're experiences, preserving or developing them if they are lands, places, communities, or objects. And these are the activities that seem to make people happy and fulfilled and are satisfying for us. So we also create and invent, seeking new experiences or the recovery of old ones. But we couldn't do any of that unless we imagine that what we build or nurture will last. As we live our lives, caring for people, music, dance, conversation, reading, other endeavors, we don't simply add experiences together, we perceive greater and greater richness in their objects, caring about them and dreading their loss, all the more with the passage of time. So now it sounds like a silly question. I think it's a pretty good question. You can tell me if you think it's silly later. How long do we want our beloved objects to last? The fact that we are often reconciled to the chaotic destruction and replacement of various things does not mean, I don't think, that we only desire them to last a certain time. When we are truly reconciled to the loss of something, it's because we've found something new. We've put our focus elsewhere, where we've transferred our love from one thing to another. We divide our attention, and I think we often do this to hedge our bets against grief and loss. We love conditionally. When the conditions fail, our love fails, we move on to something else. But I still reckon that to hold something in loving attention while reconciled to its permanent annihilation is not humanly possible. So, okay, let me see if I have time for this next section. Okay, I think I do. We started a little late, so. Rana, you say that, but we're famous for talking for a long time. The fear of death and the fear of loss then makes it difficult to devote ourselves to something completely. Because of these fears, we are naturally half-hearted. Lukewarmness is the natural condition of self-protection against loss. By contrast, wholeheartedness means putting all the eggs in one basket and waiting for them to break, as all eggs surely will. So I'm returning, in case it's not obvious, to these original figures of who are totally dedicated to something or other. And now feel free to generalize away, not just from people who are called to religious life, but anyone who seems to you totally dedicated. Socrates, for instance, is probably the easiest for this crowd. But anyone who you think is totally dedicated wholeheartedly to one love, one type of thing. So by contrast to lukewarmness, the natural condition of protection against loss, by contrast, wholeheartedness means putting all the eggs in one basket and waiting for them to break, as all eggs surely will. So we say that someone has, so if we think about these people that are totally dedicated, pick your example, either from the talk or from your own life or from elsewhere. We say that someone has dedicated their life to something, to mathematics or music or whatever, we mean they gave everything that they had to it. Okay? We don't necessarily mean that everything they did was literally musical or mathematical. But everything that doesn't contribute to the end is discarded, or maybe you discard everything that's incompatible with the thing you love most. That's just a clarification of what I mean to be totally dedicated. Now, the God who these Mother Willetta Petros and Doña Casilda dedicate themselves to, or Antony the Abbot, God is not the only person who demands wholehearted commitment without compromise. So does anyone who we seek to love unconditionally. If I claim true devotion to my romantic partner, but hedge my bets by keeping channels open with my previous liaison, or if I keep investigating real estate in lands where I know my partner is not going to live, I'm lying either to myself or to the partner or both. My love is conditional until I throw away the exit routes. I'm meant to love my child without condition. If anything else competes with my child's welfare, I've failed to love them as I should. So total dedication and wholeheartedness are among the strongest themes of the New Testament. So there's this famous passage in the book of Revelation where the voice of God who speaks through John says, the church of Laodicea, I know your works. I know you are neither cold nor hot. I wish you were either cold or hot. So because you are lukewarm, neither hot nor cold, I will spit you out of my mouth. And then you get this interesting development of what it might mean to be lukewarm. For you say, I am rich and have no need of anything, and do not realize that you are wretched, pitiable, poor, blind, and naked. So in the world of the New Testament, lukewarmness is grounds for rejection by God. The kingdom of heaven is like a pearl of great price for which one sells everything. The sons of Zebedee are fishing on the Galilee. They meet Jesus. They leave their boats and nets to follow him. So the good in question, however we understand it, is worth all of our other goods, or rather, it's incomparably more valuable than anything else. So lukewarmness and compromise suggest a double life in this picture, built around a central fantasy of self-sufficiency, where one's vulnerability and weakness is kept private. Okay, so now this is the last section. And it's not very long, so be patient. In its insistence that right living requires this singleness of mind, this wholeheartedness, the Christianity of the New Testament does not break, as I suggested earlier, with, I don't think, with the ancient philosophers. So Socrates models wholeheartedness, living in poverty, even neglecting his family for the sake of philosophy. Plato's Republic has as its central argument that justice is not just the decoration of a successful life, but worth the sacrifice of everything. And Aristotle famously counsels that we should not see our capacity for contemplative flourishing as limited or as one good among others. He exhorts us in the 10th book of his Nicomachean Ethics, we must not follow those who advise us, being men, to think of human things, and being mortal of mortal things, but must, so far as we can, make ourselves immortal, and strain every nerve to live in accordance with the best thing in us. For even if it be small in bulk, so much more does it in worth and power surpass everything. Now, the mention of immortality here is quite interesting because that also ties back to the love of the eternal. The concern of Plato and Aristotle, speaking very roughly, broadly speaking, was the fragility of lukewarmness, of compromise, given the strength of our worst motives. So we begin half-heartedly in justice, enjoying goodness and excellence along with material success and political freedom, say in our communities, luxury, comfort, we have everything. But our half-hearted justice, as suggested in the later books of the Republic, decays into hypocrisy. We hide wealth under the image of moderation, we hide brutality under respectability, or indulgence under our sense of freedom. But the parallel with the figure of Socrates suggests more than just the security of the wholehearted pursuit of wisdom versus vis-a-vis other goods, or the wholehearted pursuit of some good. Suppose we think that Socrates himself loves what's transcendent and eternal, something he suggests with some frequency in the dialogues. Perhaps as I suggested earlier, indestructible knowledge alone can satisfy my deepest longings. But if, as I said earlier, both the wise man and the fool have to face death, like the Homeric warrior and so on, it's not going to be sufficient just to love an eternal object. And this might be obvious. So if we happen to find a piece of rock that would last forever, okay, given that our love entails wanting something to last, and for our love to be satisfied, it has to last forever, it wouldn't really make sense to renounce your family and wealth and status to embrace this rock that's going to last forever. So we must ourselves, even unto death, you're clinging to this rock. Okay, it's going to last forever. I finally found the thing that meets the object of my desire. I love it forever. So we must ourselves attain eternity, a life outside of time, if this desire was placed in our hearts for a single, transcendent, and eternal object can ever be satisfied. So we began by asking what drove Mother Willata Petros, Doña Casilda, and many others to renounce wealth, rank, power, romantic love, and filial duty to serve God alone. The perception of futility or transience of things did not provoke despair or resignation. It was an occasion for falling in love. That object of love is still something that evades us. We know only at this point its basic shape, the shape that's suggested by Solomon when he says, God has put the eternal into our hearts. It's the shape of the eternal, the timeless, and the complete. So it's the shape of an eternal God for these nuns and monks that he has put into their hearts. And I conclude with what another courageous renunciant how he put it, Augustine, that our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. Okay. Now I'm ready for questions.
To love reconciled to annihilation is not humanly possible.
That's right.
And that eternity is a necessary condition for what I take to be something like true love. Or
Well,
good
I should be
love, or
careful.
right love.
For love that can be satisfied.
Love that can be satisfied. It's hard for me not to see the demand for eternity as a condition, which seems to render unconditional love impossible, unless eternity is possible.
Okay, I haven't been to philosophy grad school for a long time, so eternity is a condition. So love is impossible unless eternity is possible.
Unconditional love.
Unconditional love. I don't know if I can, on my feet, get to the bottom of the argument, but what I'm trying to communicate is that it's possible for us to love unconditionally, but not be satisfied. That is, that unconditional love never finds an object. So I don't know quite how to analyze things, the object and the love itself and the unconditionalishness of it. I think I probably have some terms mixed around in a way that's not right. But that's the thing that I'm imagining. To hold something, okay, so start from this. I'm really grateful for the question, because you get so sloppy when you give lots of talks. So and when you get old, also hate to break it to you young guys. So it seems impossible to hold something in loving attention and be reconciled to its permanent annihilation. So what's going on in that moment? I think it has something to do with, I think there's probably different senses in which my love has an object. So there's a way in which my love has a structure which seems to demand an eternal object. And there's a way in which it obviously can't, because there's at most one eternal object. So there must be a way in which regular things fall into this slot. That's why we suffer this terrible grief that can be something which can never be healed, because like a permanent wound, because we have a love for this thing that required that it be held in existence for eternity in our presence, and that's not available. So anyway, does that help, or am I still in trouble?
Yeah, it is helpful. I
Okay.
really like your image of eternal love, but I also think about so many examples. I don't know if I can come up with so many examples, but I think about instances of people whose primary emotion or primary spiritual reality is love, precisely in the face of hopelessness. So people who are staring down the barrel of imminent doom and declare themselves precisely in that moment and in virtue of that moment in a loving way.
So I think that I think this is connected. So I've done some thinking about this because, so if you take this moment of grief or a moment of poignancy, a moment of loving on the edge of the abyss, what's really going on? I think what's going on is, and this is important because for people like Nagel and Williams, who I'm talking about, although they're, in a way, I'm just using them to think about things. They want to say that, in eternity, there is no poignancy. There is no, the sense of meaning that we have entails loss. So the way I want to think about it is this. We have, in this moment of grief, in this moment of loss, the moment of love at the edge of the abyss, which is, I think, very familiar and probably what most of us experience, there's two things clashing. One is the desire for something eternal, to be eternally satisfied by something. And the other is the fact of its loss. So I think that it can't be, what makes this thing so important can't be the loss. It has to be the fact, so in the poignant moment, it's not going to be poignant if it's just a loss. It's poignant because of the desire for eternity. So that's why I think that the desire for eternity must be contributing to that sort of felt sense of meaning. And how we end up experiencing that could end up wild in all kinds of ways. But I don't think, I'm very skeptical of the idea that there's something about, we can be truly reconciled to death and destruction. I think that we can, I don't believe that we can be. There's something in us that breaks. And my guess is that's the structure of love as containing in it an image of eternity.
The example that really helped me was the example of the beloved conversation partner. So I understood there to be two important things that happened. One, valuing the conversation. But what is true, I think you said, is that if I value that conversation, then I certainly am not indifferent to the death or the destruction of the beloved conversation partner herself. And it just seems to me that it's one thing to say that, of course, I would be upset, things would be worse, my life would not go as well if the partner died. But it struck me as a much stronger thought, much further thought, to say her death would extinguish the value of the conversation, or even that her death would massively outweigh the value of ever having had the conversation in the first place. But it seemed to me that it's really those second, stronger thoughts that seem to be in your mind. And I wonder, so is that right? And if that's not right, what's the thought that you have?
It can't, this may help with the previous question too, it can't extinguish the value of the conversation. If I put it that way, it doesn't sound right at all, right? And it can't even, it also, any more than it can extinguish the value of the conversation partner. Okay. So it can't extinguish it, that can't be right. I think and maybe I need to, I've thought for a long time I need to make this clear in this particular piece, but I still haven't done it. It's, for one thing, in a way I'm temporizing to think about the bigger problem, but there's a way in which there's at least two kinds of value or two kinds of desires we have. One is the desire for happiness. So the thing which really has eternity built in it is this desire for happiness. So it's the kinds of grief which are, that as Mother Maria Scotsovas describes it, sort of tear open the fabric of the world. Those are desires in which this being that you loved constituted your happiness in some way. You had your happiness in them. So then there's also things that you value because they contribute to your happiness, or because they don't, or they're trivial in some way, and those things may not have that feature. They still are. I think they have to be derivative in some, or I'm teleological enough to think they are derivative from these desires for happiness. That's what happens when you read Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1 at a very early age. It just comes into your mind and stays forever. So I think that's one part of what I want to say. It doesn't extinguish the value. I do think, though, to flip the question around, if I think about, and this may be a bit of cheating, but let me try it. And maybe you'll just come back to me with another example. Why do we value the conversation? So what's important about it? What's lovable about it? Maybe it's a part of a very deep friendship, in which case it's quite closely linked to our happiness. Or maybe it's a way that we learn. It's some instrument in the pursuit of wisdom. Maybe there's something of both in it. But either way, there's a way in which the value of the conversation is dependent on something else. Even if that doesn't mean that its value is extinguished, or something like that, if the other thing's taken away. It just means its value comes from its other thing. So if we didn't get anything out of conversation, if there was no further end to a conversation, I don't think we would have conversations.
I'm not sure if this is in agreement with the picture you're presenting or in contrast, and that is okay. Aristotle's argument about what would really make life futile is the idea of one thing after another ad infinitum. The infinite is what would make life futile. And the thing that makes life meaningful is if there is a final end or a purpose that all these means are steps toward. And I don't know if he's serious about this argument. He suggests the argument that everything, reminds me of something you said, everything along the way would be deprived of meaning if there were no final end. And that I'm not sure I agree with. That's a really difficult question. But I also wonder if this Aristotelian argument, it seems in a way the opposite of needing eternity for purposefulness, or is it the same thing? I'm really not.
That is the way in which, in this talk, I'm really circling around a problem, because there's two different structures that I'm working with. And I actually tried harder for you guys than I ever had before to try to separate the strands, but they still got mixed up. So one thought is that this Aristotelian thought that for things to be good, they need to have a final end. The other is that for things to have value, they need to last forever. Now, I think, and these are two different arguments, there are two different strands in the talk. They keep crossing and overlapping, I think, because, and I made this argument a bit too quickly early in the talk, because I think that the kind of immanent value that many people think Aristotle is praising when he's praising the final end. So like, there you are, thinking about philosophy, or there you are, like, being courageous. There you are, enjoying something where the value is present in the thing that you're doing. I think my thought is that if that is really only lasts a moment, it doesn't satisfy that basic desire for the final end. There's something about the final end that has to be eternal. I don't think I've put it quite that clearly earlier, but I think that's the thought I'm circling around, even though I don't fully understand how the strands relate myself. So there's something about the final end. It has to last forever, and that is, interestingly enough, what in that passage at the end of the Ethics Aristotle suggests by saying we should try to become immortal. Because we want contact with this eternal object, the highest things. So somehow, we could think of that as being a kind of coincidence, it just so happens. But I think there's something about the way that we love and desire and live that aims not only at a final end, which I think is true, but also aims at a final end that's eternal. Whether or not that final end can actually be achieved, we aim at it.
So we could talk about this another time because it's a long story, but I do think Aristotle is so aware of the two strands that you're working with, that on the one hand, this one final end is a moment of in itself value that has no temporality to it, attached to it, but he also has the idea of a complete life or the extension, and how he puts those two together is a puzzle. So
it's the puzzle. Yeah, it's the puzzle. So it would be surprising if I just happened to solve a major problem, the hardest problem in Aristotle, when I just happened to be talking about some ladies who became nuns. But it would be great if it happened.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture. One of the things I really loved about it was making me realize more deeply the sort of erotic nature of human existence, the eros, that drives us for desire out of ourself to achieve communion or to consume in our search for happiness. And I could see, one way to, which is futile, which leads us to sadness. And so one way to evade that sadness would be to attempt to cease to desire, sort of stoic response. And so I was wondering if you could just comment on that, and if it's really even possible to not desire, or would the very desire to not desire be desire itself in some paradoxical way?
Right. So I think that would be another approach to the same kind of difficulty. The difficulty of transience would be to cease desiring. And I think one person who heard or read a piece of this talk suggested to me that Ida the nun in the film, I don't know how many of you have seen it, it's a great film, Ida, 5-star, that she seems like she's running away from the destruction of the thing that she loves. So she has this profound romantic encounter. She knows it's all going to come to an end, and so she's fleeing it. She's trying to kill the desire rather than to embrace a higher desire. And in the movie, actually, it's not very clear. I think that's just an alternative route. I mean, I'm more interested in what lives look like when they are at least attempting to pursue, not to stop desiring, but to desire the eternal thing. And how also, to make it sound a little bit less terrible, which I think it does sometimes, how desiring that eternal thing might also, in some way, help you to appreciate all the other things. So I don't think that somehow you transfer all of your interest and affection just on this eternal thing and then forget about everything else. It's somehow that, because that's the final end, and you depending on what kind of thing it is, it can bring all of these other things under its rubric. But anyway, I think maybe I don't have that great of a response. It seems like a perfectly good solution to stop desiring. I feel like I'm at the very primitive, desiring the eternal. Yeah. So I'd be happy to hear more about it or talk more about it. I think it's clearly a solution.
So I want to question at all the description that you provided about life and the insatisfaction that is embedded in it when you start thinking about its transience. But I wanted to ask you about this alternative, if you have any thoughts about a prescription. Because there are many times in which we have natural, or we have desires that are in us by nature, but through education we know and we try to curb them in some ways. Because I will be eating chocolate all the time if I wouldn't have been told that it was bad for me, or there seem to be ways in which we somehow realize that it is better, and maybe it leads to a more fulfilling and more pleasurable life to somehow calm certain desires and sometimes enhance others. So, because I'm thinking, what would you say to somebody who might think that it might be, after realizing that the transience of life, they might think it's hubristic of us to keep on desiring the eternal, which we seem to not be able to get, or something like that. So,
So is this related to the previous question? So it's a bit like, should I curb, if there is no eternal, should I curb my desire?
it's some idea, because I'm thinking of Buddhist monks who also, the first noble truth is life is insatisfaction, or people usually translate as suffering. And the way they deal with that is by endorsing it, and somehow they enhance their experience. But also the Stoic version also is kind of similar, things that are somehow outside of my sphere of action, I cannot deal with that, so I should not take them into account in what is going to be meaningful and of value inside of my life. So you have these different ways in which some people have, and thinkers have, tried to say, maybe we shouldn't go in that direction. Of course, the Stoics, they are also committed to God and other things, but just putting those things in brackets.
So I suppose, in the way of thinking of the talk, and maybe in general, I am committed that happiness, human flourishing, involves the pursuit of a final end. So if the character, that final end that's built into my desire to flourish and the conditions for my flourishing can't be satisfied, that means I can't flourish. Now, how we end up defining that end could be quite different in various cases. I don't know enough about Buddhism, for instance, to know whether they have a definition of it, or whether there's a kind of renunciation of flourishing as a goal, which would be possible. Right? I find it kind of scary, but it seems possible. Then, there would be a question about whether there'd be a separate set of questions, which I haven't looked into at all, whether it's possible to renounce that kind of desire to flourish. But I think in the other cases, I think a lot of the cases we would be talking about, you would be just operating under a different conception of final end. So you curb one desire or another because you have a final end in mind. And whether you could live without final ends, I don't know. It's a great question. But I don't know the answer. I have a bit more of a taste for the throwing oneself into the abyss that someone mentioned earlier, where you're like, I desire the eternal, I cannot get it. I shall love anyway. But I'm not sure whether that's a preference that's grounded in something serious, or whether it's just something I like.
I'm thinking about Augustine. He starts with that quote that you ended with, right? Our hearts are restless. But towards the end, he's thinking about eternity too, right? The whole thing on time and memory too, right? So I wonder if there's this sense for Augustine in which desire longs for eternity, and memory is the way we kind of like, we participate in that, right? So the beloved that we long for, dies. Monica dies, for example, right? But he holds her in memory, right? And that love stretches and it continues on, right?
Right.
Something like that.
There's that. This isn't directly, I mean, it's related, right? There's courtly love, right? So the love that the knight has for the beloved, or the Kierkegaardian love for the Savior in Kierkegaard, where you hold the beloved, and there's almost something wrong with trying to treat the beloved as something that would satisfy you. I don't think memory is going to be sufficient, and I don't understand Augustine on memory well enough to say what exactly he really means by it. Because at that point in the Confessions, he's delving into his own mind, and he eventually finds God there, and then makes all these incredible reflections on creation and time and the origins of all things. So I don't know whether he means simply the memory of a beloved, the psychological memory. I think he means something
a bit harder. There are these things that one finds through introspection that lead you to contemplation of eternity. So it looks, maybe it's just too hard a case for me to judge of whether memory is doing something distinct than just being a pathway into. So I think that the paper is Augustinian. I could be wrong, but it's through the memory that you encounter, that you come to encounter the ultimate object of your desire.
My mind is kind of circling around a concept that G.K. Chesterton talked about relative to an object of truth or an object of knowledge as opposed to an object of desire. I think it's in Orthodoxy. He says, the morbid logician kind of refuses for any object of knowledge or reality not to be lucid, so kind of demands that all objects of knowledge be lucid, whereas the believer allows one object to be mysterious, and therefore everything else becomes lucid. So the morbid logician demands that everything be lucid, and therefore everything is incomprehensible. But a believer allows one thing to be mysterious, and then everything else becomes lucid in its light. I'm wondering if something analogous happens here with love, where if the lover allows one object that he holds in loving attention to be eternal, that would then allow every other object of love to be transient, but not futile.
Okay, well, I don't know if I can respond directly to that question, but I would be happy to think a bit about because I think it connects to the first question. What exactly is the sense in which the object of love is eternal? It's got to be that the object of desire is not fully available to us. And in a way, of course, that makes perfect sense. Because why would you? You desire it in part. The mystery contributes in some way to your desire for it, and it has all these aspects. And you think about you can feel desire for something or someone just by seeing like a shadow of its garment, this faint trace of their existence, and you're like, oh, I have to get to know that person or that thing or that place. So there is something really crucial, and I'm really grateful for the question for that reason, about obscurity. And that's what makes it possible for us to love a human being as if they were God, or love a human being in God, like all these things. Like, how am I even using prepositions? Like, I don't even know. But somehow, I love this thing, I want it to last forever, I love this person, I want them to last forever. And somehow beyond that is some kind of eternal being, which is good. It makes sense. It also seems relevant that, at least as I understand Aquinas, your belief in an eternal being rests in your sense that being is good. So there's a way in which it rests in the love of the goodness that you've received for this person. And then you believe what they say. Yeah, it's very weird, but there's something that's easier for us to see about the mystery of desire than the mystery of the object of knowledge. So anyway, thank you for the question. I'm sorry I couldn't nail it quite down.
I wanted to go to the part of when your talk you discussed the difference between how to protect ourselves from the feeling of futility, we don't put all our eggs in one basket. But then you gave the example of all the stories of people who seemingly did put all their eggs in one basket. And what I wanted to get at is, like, who is actually living out happiness more than? Is it the person who's curbing their desires but is more realistic, understanding that things will not fully fulfill their true, what I think the term uses, true love? So they're being more realistic throughout their life till they reach their final end? Or is it the person living out more true happiness, the one who puts all their eggs in that one basket but could potentially risk it all to be kind of like had the carpet pulled out of them?
That's a beautiful question. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's a great. I think the reason why the lukewarm attitude, the like divide the, take a little bit of this and a little bit of that to avoid the catastrophic loss. The reason why that's not fully just being smart, I think it's because it involves a kind of self-deception in some way. And I don't know if I could explain exactly why or how, but if it's true that your basic desire for your own flourishing has this structure where it should last forever, then there's something worthwhile. There has to be, and that's going to be something really fundamental to who you are. And I think you can't, for whatever reason. I find it very hard to believe that you could sort of prudentially just love things a little bit here, a little bit there, fully aware that what you really wanted was something lasting forever, but not thinking it was possible. There's something that I think when people do that, which is very commonly, and I do it all the time, it's not transparent to the person who's doing it. It's all happening under a cloud. Like if you've ever known like a truly serial monogamist, right? Who's like, oh my God, I'm so in love. Then like 2 weeks later, they're like, oh my gosh, not about that guy. This guy, they are amazing. And if you know someone like that, you're like, there's something wrong here. This person is not living, and there's something going on that's not connecting with other people. So I think that's the reason. So I think that the other alternative over here, which is to try to detach from your own desire for human flourishing, I think that would be something which was self-aware, self-conscious, like you know what you're doing and you're seeking flourishing through the alternate route. So at that point we have like 3 alternatives, right? So one is there's an eternal being that you recognize and you devote your life to them. Everything derives its good from that. And then there's another life where there's nothing eternal, you know it, you throw yourself in and just feel that pain every time that you lose something. And then there's a third possibility where you detach from your own desire for flourishing and try to live a life that's truly in the present.
I think Homer's Olympian gods it's a brilliant thought experiment to imagine all of the different human lives, different human types, writ large, but immortal. And certainly a powerful interpretation of Homer, not the only one, is that their lives, there's a loss of meaningfulness, that human life is meaningful because it's cut short, because it doesn't go on forever. It's a great thought experiment, I think Homer undertook.
No, and so I can't resist saying this because it's one of my favorite things in Aristotle. There's this neglected argument in the 3rd book of the Metaphysics, so Metaphysics Beta, where Aristotle thinks about the possibility of the gods eating nectar and ambrosia. And he's like, why would they do that? Are they really immortal? Do they have to keep eating to keep themselves immortal? Or are they eating just for pleasure? That doesn't seem really godlike. So it's a hilarious passage. So I think that thought is the thought which is really motivating to the philosophers who I was thinking about. So I think they think an immortal life would be a terrible life. So, and there's something, I think I understand the intuition. I think that I tend to find that point of view not to be expressed with full recognition of how much it means to us to have an eternal object or desires or a prospect of eternal life. And I also hope that there is some kind of concept of eternal life that isn't just going on in the same old way, right? It's not just living a human life forever. And I think that's also what you're getting a bit at the end of the Confessions, where you get to a different, Augustine had been so scandalized by the idea that the world had started in time. And so he has to think about creation in this way where
in some sense, it's not that it comes to be in time, but it does come to be from God. It comes to be, anyway, it's something very complicated and difficult. But you have to think that if you go along the routes of an eternal being, you have to think that there's another level of what it means to be. And it's not just going on like this forever. And again, I do want to repeat this. I think it's really important that there's the fact that we value things because they come to an end. That doesn't feel right to me. That I did try to address it in fact. That moment of valuing something even though it comes to an end doesn't seem to be directed at its endingness. It's at this other promise of some value that's beyond its destruction. Anyway, thank you so much for the question.